Two lakes are dying right now. Today, one is turning to toxic dust. The other is closing in on total system failure. These are not small, isolated ponds in the backwoods. These are the two great pillars of water for the American West, the Great Salt Lake and Lake Mead, and they are collapsing in perfect, terrifying synchrony. The Great Salt Lake has already lost 70% of its surface area. 70%. That is not a forecast. That is not a worst-case climate model. That is the measured, documented reality of what has already vanished. And now, the lakebed it left behind, laced with a century of industrial runoff, including arsenic, is blowing into the air breathed by 2.5 million people. If you live in the West or know someone who does, tell us in the comments what you're seeing on the ground. We read every one. Now, we are a small, independent team, and a lot of viewers who value this reporting forget to subscribe. Our ability to make these documentaries depends entirely on your support. If you believe this work is important, please take 1 second and hit the subscribe button. It's the single best way to ensure we can keep making them. Now let's begin. This is not a story about a distant environmental problem. It is a story about math, and the math is closing in. To understand the scale of what is happening, you have to go back to November of 2022. That month, the gauges on the southern edge of the Great Salt Lake registered a number that hydrologists had feared for decades: 4,188.5 feet, the lowest water level ever recorded in 170 years of history. A line had been crossed. The largest saline lake in the entire Western Hemisphere was shrinking into a shallow, hypersalinated puddle. The ecosystem that supports 10 million migratory birds was failing, and the shoreline was receding so fast it was pulling away from the city that built its identity on the lake's very name. The easy answer is climate change. And that answer is not wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. A. Park Williams, a hydroclimatologist at UCLA whose work is fundamental to this story, confirmed in a landmark 2022 study that the last 2 decades are the driest the West has seen in at least 1,200 years, going all the way back to the year 800 C. His research found that about 42% of the soil moisture deficit, the sheer dryness of the ground, can be blamed directly on human-caused warming. The air is thirstier, the sun is harsher, evaporation is accelerating. But that is not what is killing the Great Salt Lake. That is merely the accelerant on a fire that was lit a long, long time ago. The real cause is much simpler. The lake is being starved. 3 rivers are meant to feed it: the Bear River, the Weber River, and the Jordan River. Together, they are the lake's entire lifeblood. But they are being intercepted, diverted for farms, for lawns, for the homes of a booming population along Utah's Wasatch Front. The Bear River alone is supposed to provide up to 60% of the water that reaches the lake. Supposed to. Most of it never gets there. It is captured and consumed before it can complete its journey. Every gallon used upstream is a gallon the lake will never see. This is the central, unavoidable truth of the Great Salt Lake's demise. It is not just an act of nature. It is the direct result of a century of human choices, accumulating year after year. The problem began in July of 1847 when Brigham Young and the first Mormon pioneers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. They saw the creeks tumbling out of the Wasatch Mountains. And they did what any civilization in a desert does. They immediately began digging ditches to divert City Creek, redirecting the water to grow the crops they needed to survive. It was the first act in a long drama of consumption that would, 175 years later, bring the entire system to its knees. And here is the part that turns this from a local tragedy into a continental crisis. As the lakebed dries, it exposes sediments that have been accumulating for millennia. The lake is what's known as a terminal basin. Water flows in, but it never flows out, except through evaporation. For thousands of years, every mineral, every heavy metal washed down from the surrounding mountains has settled on the bottom and stayed there. We are talking about mercury, selenium, and, most frighteningly, arsenic. For as long as that lakebed was covered by water, the toxins were safely locked away. Now they are exposed to the air. As the wind sweeps across miles of newly dried playa, it picks up that dust and carries it directly into the Salt Lake City metro area. An invisible plume of poison aimed at the lungs of more than 2 million people. This is not a hypothetical risk. It is a public health catastrophe waiting to happen. The story of the Great Salt Lake is no longer about saving a lake. It is about preventing what scientists have called one of the worst environmental dust disasters in North American history. This is exactly the kind of critical context that gets lost in daily headlines. If you agree and you're getting value from this analysis, let us know in the comments below. Now travel 500 miles south to the border of Nevada and Arizona. Here, a second, even larger body of water is sending out the exact same signals of distress. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States by capacity, the beating heart of the lower Colorado River, providing water to nearly 40 million people across 7 states and Mexico. And just like the Great Salt Lake, it is disappearing in real time. In July of 2022, just 4 months before the Great Salt Lake hit its own rock bottom, Lake Mead fell to 1,040 feet above sea level, its lowest point since it was first filled in the 1930s. The images went global. A stark white bathtub ring staining the canyon walls, showing where the water used to be. Pleasure boats from decades past, once hundreds of feet underwater, now resting on dry, cracked mud. Human remains discovered in barrels, exposed by the receding shoreline. The lake was revealing its secrets as it died. The forces killing Lake Mead are a mirror image of the ones killing the Great Salt Lake. A 2-decade megadrought, supercharged by climate change, has shrunk the Colorado River itself. But just like in Utah, the real story, the one that made this collapse inevitable, began a century ago. It was a story of bad math. On November 24th, 1922, a group of delegates from 7 western states gathered in Santa Fe, New Mexico, to sign one of the most consequential documents in American history, the Colorado River Compact. Chaired by then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, their goal was to divide the river's water, to bring order to the chaos of the arid West. They allocated 7.5 million acre-feet of water per year to the upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, and another 7. 5 million to the lower basin California, Arizona, Nevada, a total of 15 million acre-feet, plus a later treaty obligation to Mexico. It was a tidy, ambitious plan. And it was based on a lie. The measurements used to calculate the river's flow were taken during the wettest period the region had seen in over 1,000 years. Tree ring data, which scientists like A. Park Williams now use to reconstruct past climate, shows that the early 20th century was an extreme anomaly. The river they were measuring wasn't the real river. They were measuring a ghost. A temporary, unusually wet version of the Colorado that rarely exists in nature. For 100 years, the West has been built on this mathematical error. They legally entitled themselves to paper water, the water promised in the compact, while the river could only ever provide wet water, what actually flowed from the mountains. This created a structural deficit from day one. Every year, the states of the lower basin, particularly, were allowed to take more water out of Lake Mead than the river put back in. It was simple arithmetic. A bank account where withdrawals consistently exceed deposits. For decades, the massive storage capacity of Lake Mead and its upstream partner, Lake Powell, masked the problem. The reservoirs acted like giant savings accounts, buffering against dry years. But after 22 years of the worst megadrought in 12 centuries, the savings are gone. The buffer no longer exists. The system is running on fumes. On August 16th, 2021, the federal government was forced to acknowledge this reality. For the first time in history, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation declared a Tier 1 water shortage on the Colorado River. It was a landmark admission that the math had finally caught up. The declaration triggered mandatory cuts in water deliveries for 2022. Arizona's Central Arizona Project, a massive 336-mile canal that supplies cities and farms, was hit the hardest due to its junior water rights. Nevada and Mexico also took cuts, and here is the part that should stop you cold. Those cuts were not enough. The lake kept dropping. The head of the Bureau of Reclamation, Commissioner Camille Taton, was forced to go before Congress in June of 2022 and deliver an ultimatum. The 7 basin states had to figure out how to conserve an additional 2 to 4 million acre-feet of water, an astonishing, unprecedented amount, or the federal government would do it for them. The system was so close to collapse, she warned, that without drastic action, they risked reaching dead pool. Dead pool is not a dramatic metaphor. It is a precise engineering term. At Lake Mead, dead pool is 895 feet. At that elevation, the water level is so low it can no longer flow past the Hoover Dam through its hydroelectric turbines. It effectively cuts off the water supply for California, Arizona, and Mexico. It silences the massive power generators that provide electricity to millions. It is the point of total system failure. In the summer of 2022, the surface of Lake Mead was just 145 vertical feet above that point. The scale of this is hard to comprehend. If you've been watching this far and realize someone in your life needs to understand this interconnected crisis, this is the moment to share this video. Send it to family. And if you're getting value, a simple click of the like button tells us to make more documentaries just like this. It genuinely helps. So we have 2 monumental lakes, 2 pillars of the West, both in a state of freefall, one poisoned by its own history, the other drained by a century-old math mistake. They seem like separate tragedies, playing out in parallel, 500 miles apart, one in a terminal basin, one on a river that flows to the sea. But they are not separate. Their fates are physically, mechanically, and explicitly linked by a piece of engineering so audacious it almost defies belief. A project that takes water from the dying Colorado River Basin and pipes it directly into the heart of the dying Great Salt Lake Basin. It is called the Central Utah Project. To understand it, you have to look at a map. The Uinta Mountains in northeastern Utah form a massive wall between 2 worlds. On the eastern slope, rain and snowmelt flow into tributaries of the Green River, which then flows into the Colorado River, destined for Lake Powell, Lake Mead, and eventually the Gulf of California. On the western slope, all water flows into the Great Basin, destined for the Great Salt Lake, where it evaporates. 2 completely distinct watersheds, separated by a continental divide, or at least they were. Starting in the 1960s, authorized by the Colorado River Storage Project Act of 1956, engineers began to build a mechanical river. A series of dams, reservoirs, tunnels, and aqueducts designed to punch a hole through that divide. The Central Utah Project, or CUP, captures water high in the Uinta Basin, water that belongs to the Colorado River system, and pumps it west, through the mountains, into the populated Wasatch Front. A transbasin diversion, a drop of rain that falls on the Uinta Mountains, naturally bound for Lake Mead, can now be siphoned into the Strawberry Aqueduct, piped through the Wasatch Range, and used to water a lawn in a suburb of Salt Lake City. That water, once consumed, flows into the local wastewater system, gets treated, and is discharged into the Jordan River, which flows into the Great Salt Lake, where it ultimately evaporates. Humans have created a Frankenstein plumbing system that directly connects the 2 collapsing basins. The Bonneville unit of the Central Utah Project alone is authorized to divert over 100,000 acre-feet of Colorado River water every single year. It accounts for about 15% of all the Colorado River water Utah consumes. This single piece of infrastructure means that the survival of Utah's biggest cities is now dependent on both failing systems at the same time. They are draining the tributaries of the Great Salt Lake from within, while simultaneously importing water from the equally stressed Colorado River from without. It is a hydrological doom loop, a crisis feeding a crisis. When Commissioner Tautone demanded that the 7 basin states cut up to 4 million acre-feet of use, that demand applied to Utah, too. Every drop of Colorado River water diverted through the cup to the Wasatch Front is a drop that is no longer flowing down to Lake Powell and Lake Mead, making their crisis worse. Meanwhile, that same imported water fuels growth in a region that is already consuming the rivers that are supposed to sustain the Great Salt Lake, and that is where the atmospheric connection makes it all so much worse. Climatologists have identified what they call a quasi-decadal oscillation, or QDO. It's a 10 to 20 year climate pattern that links the atmospheric conditions over both basins. When one is dry, the other tends to be dry. Their fates were always cosmically linked by the sky. Now, we have physically linked them on the ground with pipes and pumps. I know I've asked before, but this is the kind of story that takes a massive team effort to uncover. If you are still watching, it means you find this valuable. Please, take the 2 seconds it takes and hit subscribe. We have one of the lowest subscription rates on the platform for our viewership, and changing that is the only way we can continue our mission. Think of it as a vote for this kind of journalism. It would be comforting to think that our leaders in the 19th and early 20th centuries were simply ignorant. That they couldn't have known. But they were warned. Explicitly, the most famous warning came from a one-armed Civil War veteran and geologist named John Wesley Powell. In 1869, Powell led a legendary expedition down the Green and Colorado rivers, mapping the last uncharted territory in the continental United States. He saw the canyons, he saw the deserts, and he understood the fundamental truth of the land. It was arid. In 1893, Powell stood before the International Irrigation Conference in Los Angeles. A room full of boosters and politicians giddy with dreams of turning the West into a green paradise. And he told them the one thing they did not want to hear. When all the rivers are used, he said, when all the creeks and the ravines, when all the brooks, when all the springs are used, there is still not sufficient water to irrigate all this arid land. He was heckled. He was dismissed as a pessimist. The dominant fantasy was one of unlimited growth, of conquering nature. Powell advocated for drawing state boundaries along watershed lines so that water rights would be managed by communities who shared the same river. Instead, we drew straight lines on a map, ignoring hydrology completely. We followed the vision of the boosters, not the scientists. And a century later, we are living in the world John Wesley Powell predicted, a world running out of water. This is the deeper diagnosis of the Western water crisis. It's not just a drought. Brad Udall, a senior water scientist at Colorado State University and one of the leading experts on the Colorado River, has been arguing for years that we need to change our language. What the West is experiencing, he says, is not a drought, because drought implies that things will eventually return to normal. What we are living through is aridification. Aridification is a permanent climate change-driven shift to a hotter, drier baseline. It means less snowpack in the mountains, the natural reservoirs that store winter moisture. It means that when the snow does melt, more of it evaporates or soaks into the parched soil before it ever reaches a river. It means the normal of the 20th century is gone forever. The West is simply becoming more of a desert. The amount of water we thought we had never really existed, and the amount that does exist, is shrinking. And yet, the systems of law and economics are still catching up to this new reality. After the crisis summer of 2022, a miracle happened. The winter of 2022-2023 brought record-breaking snow to the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada. An atmospheric river event drenched California. Lake Mead and Lake Powell saw their levels rise slightly, a temporary reprieve. The Great Salt Lake rose a few feet from its historic low. For a moment, it felt like the crisis was over. The headlines celebrated the recovery. But the experts were not celebrating. They were warning. 1 or 2 wet winters cannot erase a 22-year, 1,200-year megadrought. They don't fix the structural deficit in the Colorado River Compact. They don't solve the problem of upstream diversions in the Great Basin. All they do is buy a little bit of time. That time is now being spent in one of the most contentious negotiations in American history. The 2007 interim guidelines that have governed the Colorado River for the past 2 decades are set to expire at the end of 2026. The 7 states are now locked in a bitter fight over who has to cut and by how much in the decades to come. The lower basin states argue the upper basin hasn't had to sacrifice enough. The upper basin states argue the lower basin has been living beyond its means for a century and that huge amounts of water are lost to evaporation as it flows through the desert to get to them. It is a battle over every last drop. It is a fight over who gets to keep their farms, who gets to keep their cities, who gets to survive in a hotter, drier future. And it's a fight that was foretold by John Wesley Powell in 1893. He warned that in an arid land, when the water runs out, I tell you, gentlemen, you are piling up a heritage of conflict and litigation over water rights. for there is not sufficient water to supply these lands. The conflict is here. So where does that leave us? Stand on the southern shore of the Great Salt Lake today. You can walk for miles across a cracked, dusty landscape that used to be the bottom of a lake. The air smells sulfuric. When the wind picks up, you can feel the grit on your teeth, and you wonder what exactly is in it. You are standing on the exposed edge of a looming public health crisis. Stand on the Hoover Dam overlook and stare at the white bathtub ring on the walls of Black Canyon. It is a geological scar, 20 stories high, a tombstone marking where the water used to be. You are looking at a system so stressed, so overallocated, that the federal government is now planning for a future where they may have to physically bypass the hydroelectric turbines just to get water downstream, sacrificing electricity to keep the taps from running dry in Phoenix and Los Angeles. These are not future scenarios. This is the present reality. A story of two collapsing water systems, linked by wishful thinking, bad math, and a Frankenstein network of pipes. They are the twin canaries in the coal mine of the American West, and they are both gasping for air. The warnings were ignored for a century. The math was denied. The growth was relentless. And now the bills are coming due.